So what was Rancé's attitude to the Mother of God? Well, there are three indications as to his attitude. One is the statues he had made of her. Secondly, a description from one of his early biographers of his own devotion to her. And thirdly, the writings that directly reflect upon her. I'm just going to do these things quite briefly. But with regard to the statues, a writer writing, in fact, actually in the 19th century, but with good sources at his disposal, tells us that the Virgin was always honoured at La Trappe with a special devotion, he says, and remained of major importance to the brothers right down until the dissolution of the abbey at the Revolution. And the Rancé himself erected 3 statues of the Mother of God. Now, the first of these, the most important, was placed on the altar, the high altar of the church. And I'm quoting this priest now, a man called Pierre Hamon, Hamon. He says, the one placed on the altar was of a beauty so pure and perfect that one found it worthy of classical antiquity. The abbot had acquired it for a very high price, being of the opinion that, for the sake of the Mother of God, one could depart from the rule which prescribed poverty everywhere. Note that for good reasons one could depart from the rule which prescribed poverty everywhere. And if the Mother of God was not a good enough reason to prescribe to deviate from the rule, then there was nothing. No deviation at all. And he describes it. In one hand she held the infant Jesus, on one arm it was her left arm, and in the other a hanging chain bearing the Holy Eucharist, a hanging pyx, as had been the case of Citeaux, the great Abbey of Citeaux, for many centuries. And this is quite true. The hanging pyx was, in fact, in the form of a dove, as you might expect. The dove of the Holy Spirit had indeed been at Citeaux. At her feet, an angel with arms outspread contemplated the Holy Sacrament, and a second angel, with head bowed and arms crossed on the breast, adored it in profound recollection. And in fact, we have engravings from the 18th century of the church in the Abbey Church at La Trappe, which shows clearly the picture of the statue of the Mother of God. And at the very foot of the statue of the Mother of God, right at the base on which the little pedestal on which the Mother of God was standing, was the title in Greek letters, Theotoko, to the God-bearer. So Rancé was actually using the Greek word Theotokos, God-bearer, and it says to the Mother of God in Greek at the foot of this very lovely, what at the time was regarded as a very, very lovely statue. And there were two others of which we don't know very much. In fact, we know very little at all about one of them. A second one was to be found in the choir of the lay brothers choir, and we have no description of that one whatsoever. No description at all. But he put a third one. There was already a little one, but over the door, the entrance to the abbey, but Rancé apparently replaced it with a much larger statue of the Mother of God right over the entrance to the Abbey of La Trappe. You will not be surprised at this. But what's interesting about that, we don't have a description of what it was like, or whether presumably she was holding infant Jesus. We don't know that. But what we do know is that Rancé, on the pedestal that held up this statue right at the entrance to La Trappe, was that he had engraved certain words from a certain person. Who was the certain person? Bernard of Clairvaux. Not, in this case, John of the Ladder, but Bernard of Clairvaux, who, as you know, was utterly devoted to the Mother of God himself. What did it say? Upheld by Mary, it was in Latin of course, but it says, upheld by Mary we do not fall, protected by her we do not fear. With her favour we arrive at our goal. That was Rancé's view of the Mother of God. More to be said yet, but that was his view of the Mother of God. It's actually an abbreviated form, an abbreviated version, a slightly abbreviated version of what Bernard actually says, which is, upheld by her one does not fall, protected by her one does not fear, guided by her one does not tire, with her favour one arrives at her goal. And that's from the second of the homilies in praise of the Virgin Mary, which of course was one of Bernard's literary masterpieces. It's totally unoriginal, as Chrysogonus Waddell says. There's not an unoriginal thought in it, but it's very beautifully set out, and particularly the passage on Mary as the star of the sea and the guide to us in our difficulties. This is Rancé's view, Bernard's view of the Mother of God. Upheld by Mary one does not fall, protected by her we do not fear, with her favour we arrive at our goal. So in other words, we know that he erects statues to the Virgin, a new statue to the Virgin, and we also know from one of his early biographers his own views as to the Virgin. Who was this biographer? As I've said elsewhere, we have far too many biographies of Rancé, and they tend to vary from the highly critical. There's one by a man called Bremont, which is really totally out to lunch, and those which are completely adulatory, looking to him as sort of, there was a move to make Rancé, to have Rancé canonized after his death, which came to nothing, I might add. But we have lots of biographies. One of the earliest and one of the best was by a man called Peter Lenain, L-E, and then N-A-I-N, Pierre Lenain. He was born in Paris in 1640, started off life as a Victorine, i.e. as a monk of the Abbey of St. Victor in Paris, heard about La Trappe, had to go and see it, did so, was won over totally by the spirit of La Trappe and the charisma of Rancé, and entered the abbey when he was 28 in 1668. He became sub-prior of La Trappe and knew Rancé very well indeed. There were moves afoot. I don't go into it again, we needn't go into the details. There were moves afoot for a biography of Rancé. There was sufficient interest in him, huge interest in him, to want a biography, and Pierre Lenain was approached to write it. We know that a considerable amount of material was made available to him from the Abbey, and that he interviewed, talked with people who knew Rancé earlier and later. He did as thorough a job as he could have done in the 18th century. And in fact, in, let me think, 15 or 16, I can't quite remember, I think it was in 16, the biography was actually published. It's quite long. It's in 3 small duodecimal volumes. Those are small volumes, maybe 5 inches by 7 inches, something like that. Not very thick in themselves, about 250 pages each, but there are 3 volumes. So it's a really detailed account of Rancé's life and of all the biographies until very recent time, when Alban Crailsheimer produced his own biography of Rancé in the 1970s. It is one of the best of the early biographies, and certainly one of the most balanced. But the interesting thing about it is it exists in 2 editions. The edition of 1716, if I remember rightly, and certainly the edition, which I do remember rightly, of 1719, published 3 years later. This second edition is much enlarged, and exactly who enlarged it and edited it is not quite clear, because it appeared after the death of Pierre Lenain himself. He died, in fact, in 1713. His biography has appeared after his death. He was in his 70s when he died. But the 1719 second edition of the life of Rancé has a long title, as you might expect, is really quite remarkable. In the first edition, Pierre Lenain has a brief account of saying the Abbé de Rancé was certainly devoted to the Mother of God and erected statues, etc., etc. The second edition has a much longer discussion of his view of Mary. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to have to read to you something of what Pierre Lenain says. After Rancé's devotion to the most holy sacrament of the altar, which should occupy the first place in the heart of every true believer, there comes next a devotion, a devout love for the most holy Virgin Mother of God. The Reverend Father, that's Rancé, the Reverend Father's veneration for the Queen of Heaven and Earth, those are typical titles for Mary going back to the medieval period. The Reverend Father's veneration for the Queen of Heaven and Earth was so great that it could not possibly have been any greater. He himself never pronounced the majestic name of Mary without bowing his head, and when one day he noticed that one of his monks failed to do so, he reproved him so strongly that he made all the other brothers shake in their shoes. He finished correcting the monk with these words. "What's this?" he said. "Do you mean to pronounce this holy name of Mary as if it were just an ordinary name? Ah," he says, "if you had seen but a single ray of the light which surrounds the Queen of the Angels," another typical title of Mary going back to the medieval period. "If you had seen but a single ray of light which surrounds the Queen of the Angels, you would have been seized as much with dread as with deference, and I doubt that your soul would have been able to tolerate that radiance without being separated from your body." And as he said these things, says Lenain, his face seemed to blaze with fire, which made one think that he was then receiving some special favour from this mother of pure love, Mary, who has so much tenderness for those who love and serve her. So there's no question about his devotion, and I haven't finished yet. Listen now. When the brothers who came to see him in his room withdrew from his presence, he would bid them farewell by saying, "I commend you to our Lord and his Holy Mother." Always. This true son of the great Saint Bernard, says Lenain, this true son of the great Saint Bernard would imitate this Holy Father Bernard in leading all his dear children to a true devotion to the patroness of their order. And she was called the patroness of her order from the very earliest days of the foundation of the Cistercian order. And he said to his monks one day, "I never tire," said Rancé, "of speaking to you of how I am obliged to commend you, how I have no choice but to commend you to the Holy Virgin. This is something I do at every opportunity. Indeed," he says, this is Rancé, "it is impossible to draw your attention too often to this duty, since one can truthfully say that our very salvation depends upon it." Because, of course, Mary, for him, like Bernard, is the mediatrix, the mediatress, the advocate, advocata nostra, and the second Eve, who does not bring salvation, but who is a channel of salvation because of her intercession with her Son. So he says so. We cannot truthfully say that our very salvation depends upon invoking Mary. And I've always considered as being worthy of reproof, the ideas of those who say that this is not a precept, a command, and that one can be saved without invoking the Holy Virgin. Rancé says that's not possible. We have to have the help of a mediatress and advocate in order to be saved. Truly, and he's absolutely clear on this, His Mariology cannot be separated from his Christology, which is true of all the great Cistercian abbots. He cannot. He's no Mariolater. Mariolatry doesn't even exist in his thought. No, everything comes through Christ, but it comes from Christ through Mary, as is clear in Bernard and so many others as well. Aelred, Isaac of Stella, certainly Amadeus of Lausanne, certainly Ogier of Locedio, and others as well. But there's no question that Mary is essential to the process of salvation. She cooperates with Christ. She cooperates with Christ in the work of redemption. She is the crowned Queen of Heaven. Medieval idea appears in Bernard, and that is Rancé's view. That is Rancé's view. And indeed, he suggests, no question about it, he says, how close is the relationship between Christ and Mary? Consider how close that relationship was. And he says, quoting Augustine, Caro Christi, caro Maria, the flesh of Christ was the flesh of Mary. This is one of the great verses, or great statements from Augustine, which played an important part in the doctrine of the corporeal assumption of Mary. The flesh of Christ is the flesh of Mary. And it follows, he says, from this, any indifference we may have for the mother, if we are indifferent to Mary, we are therefore by definition indifferent to the Son. And if we praise Mary, we are by definition praising the Son. Once again, everything comes from the Son through Mary, but everything goes up through Mary to the Son. We are not venerating Mary. We are venerating Mary because by venerating the Mother of God, says Rancé, that veneration passes on directly to her Son, who is, of course, God himself. I cannot understand, says Rancé himself, I cannot understand how anyone can have a care for their salvation if they do not have recourse to this divine mother, either to obtain the graces we need or to be happily guided from this vale of tears to the haven of our salvation, to be rescued from the disorderliness and vice in which we have had the misfortune to be immersed. The Church, who as our good mother has always applied herself to seeking out the most profitable ways of ensuring the salvation of her children, could not have found a more appropriate means than this, i.e. invoking the help and intercession of the Mother of God. And he goes on again and again at this great length. And so he concludes, I'm not reading the whole thing, for this reason, my dear brothers, we cannot be too diligent or too assiduous in addressing her. You tell me, perhaps, that every day you chant hymns and canticles to her praise. My reply to you is that this is a good thing. This is an excellent thing. But you should not stop there. You will certainly not fulfill the obligations you owe to her as monks, and as monks of the order of Cito in particular, if you do not add to your prayers and do not add to the prayers and suffrages we say publicly. We say publicly and in common, if you do not add to those some private practices by which you honour her as you call upon her. The recitation of the Rosary, for example, one of the few indications that the Rosary was in fact used at La Trappe. The recitation of the Rosary, for example, or for those who have the time to do it, other litanies, other prayers, and should also make aspirations and elevations of the heart to her as to our protectress, saying to her from the depths of your heart, in Latin of course, to you our eyes are turned, do not let us perish, O Blessed Virgin, which is from the Roman Breviary at the time. Listen again, this is the end of it. I tell you, my brothers, as far as I am concerned, I count it a day lost and very badly spent if I do not find a few moments to call on her for aid, commending to her my salvation. I encourage you, too, to do the same thing, And if you fail to do so, it will only be by deviating from my express wish. Obedience again. For as I have just said to you, devotion to the Holy Virgin, the Mother of God, is one of the most powerful aids for your sanctification that God has ever placed in your hands. Now, there's nothing more to be said on that score. His absolute deep devotion to the Virgin Mother of God, the protectress of the order, the patroness of the order, the mediatrix, the mediator, the advocate, could not be more clear in this, nor could it more clear that he is not any, as I said before, he is not in any way worshipping Mary, for everything that goes to Mary redounds to her Son, but it is through her Son that salvation is transmitted through Mary because of her intercession, her prayers. And the third thing, which I'm not going to go into in any detail whatsoever, is that Rancé does in fact leave us with a number of materials specifically dealing with Mary. He in fact has 5 conferences specifically dealing with the Mother of God, one on the Nativity of Mary, one on the Annunciation, and no less than 3 on the Assumption of Mary. And if you can possibly possess yourselves in patience, you'll be able to read actually an English translation of all those conferences, together with a little commentary and notes, which in fact I hope to have ready and perhaps in publication next year, 2020, sometime then. They're all translated, they just need to be polished and done. There's also another thing which he wrote to a laywoman, where he also deals with the devotion to the Virgin Mary and her importance in the life of not just of monks and nuns, but also, of course, of lay people, and as far as he was concerned, of all Christians. So there's no doubt that when Rancé was accused of, or when the accusation went up that Mary was neglected at La Trappe, this is arrant nonsense, as indeed many of the criticisms levied against Rancé and La Trappe are arrant nonsense, but not all. So let me conclude this series of conferences by giving perhaps an overall assessment, just my own assessment. You'll have your own, of course, your own assessment, but to make some broad generalizations about what was good and what wasn't so good about Almangeon de Rancé.
Qui condolens